From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 69. I've got a good friend and longtime colleague on the show today. He comes from the rehabilitation world, but we've had some awesome discussions on collaborating and bridging the gap between rehab and performance. And it actually speaks to the product that we have on sale this week together. So this is a timely show that's going to attack some of the common debated points in the world of managing baseball athletes and really all overhead athletes. So we're in for a really good show. In lieu of a sponsor this week, I wanted to give you a heads up on a sale that we're running on one of our most popular resources. Functional Stability Training is a resource that Mike Reinold and I collaborated on to make sure that rehab professionals and strength conditioning coaches were speaking the same language and collaborating so that athletes could get moving efficiently and headed in the right direction. This week, we're going to do 25% off on all functional stability training modules, which includes upper body, lower body, core, and optimizing movement. And you get an even bigger discount if you purchase all four together. This sale is going to be active until this Sunday, July 26th at midnight. And it's going to get you 25% off if you use the coupon code MLB2020EC at functionalstability.com. Again, that's 25% off on any of the functional stability training offerings with coupon code MLB2020EC at functionalstability.com. Today's guest received his BS in physical therapy from Northeastern University and his doctorate in physical therapy from the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute of Health Professions. He's also a board-certified athletic trainer and certified strength and conditioning specialist. Following his education, he served as facility director of Champion Sports Medicine and the coordinator of rehabilitation research and clinical education at the American Sports Medicine Institute in Birmingham, Alabama, under the direction of Dr. James Andrews. He moved on to serve as both a head athletic trainer and physical therapist for the Red Sox and transitioned to a consultant role for the Chicago Cubs in the years that followed. Now, in addition to running his private practice, Champion Physical Therapy and Performance in Waltham, Massachusetts, he serves as a senior medical advisor for the Chicago White Sox. As a researcher, he has been published extensively in prestigious journals such as the AJSM, JOSPT, and the Journal of Sports Health, and he's also contributed many book chapters to prominent sports medicine publications. His research has won numerous awards, including the 2019 Sport Health's David T. Sisk Award for Best Original Research and the 2002 Excellence in Research Award by the JOSPT. He was also awarded the 2019 ASMI Career Service Award by Dr. James Andrews, Glenn Fleissig, and Kevin Wilk for his contributions to the baseball sports medicine world. I've been fortunate to collaborate with him on a number of products, seminars, and athletes over the past decade, and he's become a good friend and helpful resource to me. Please welcome to the show, Mike Reinold. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having me, man. It's, obviously an honor to be involved in, this really awesome podcast. I've been listening and learning a lot from all the past guests you've had on there. So, it's a blast to get to finally be on and talk shop with you, man.
I think this will be a fun one. So first off, shamelessly, this coincides with a sale we are running. So we should put that out there front and center. Our functional stability training products, which date back a while because there's upper body, lower body, core, and then optimizing movement is kind of like a resounding principles that unify all those things, is on sale. It starts Wednesday, July 22nd, and then Sunday, July 26th at midnight. It's 25% off on all FST products. But I think, this will be a good one to kind of, frame the sale. So folks can get 25% off with MLB 2020 EC as their coupon code at functionalstability.com. But a lot has happened since we first recorded, the first installment of that. We did optimal shoulder performance before that. You've been in baseball, in MLB in some capacity, probably since, the mid 2000s. And I followed not long after that. So I'm curious to get your take on a few things that have evolved. So the first one, we're gonna attack some old wives' tales and things like that in the industry. So the other day, I put up an Instagram Q&A, and somebody asked, what's something that you did 10 years ago with respect to managing baseball athletes that you no longer do? And it was like the easiest answer ever. And it was just sleep or stretch. To that, I probably got 40 or 50 replies of, wait, what? Or what do you do
Come on.
instead? No way. You got
Really?
rid of it.
Really?
Yeah, it was that much. This is a hot topic. So, and I know you've been fighting this battle as well. And you know, I think we probably fought it from different angles too over the years. So, all right, let's put it out there first. Where did your brain start on sleep or stretch? Probably 15 years ago. And where is it now?
So it's actually a good question. I wonder, before we get too deep, who do you think was asking you those questions? Was it players themselves or was it coaches? Like, who do you think was jumping in? Could you tell?
I think it's much more coaches. And then, the other
Got
thing
it.
that's interesting, I was surprised. I had like 3 or 4 young PTs, just out of
Yeah.
school who,
Yeah.
they had seen it in a course or they've seen it online. And, it is like you
Yeah.
see something once on Instagram, you don't always see the correction 10 years later, right? So,
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so I'd say I probably haven't done a sleeper stretch in, heck, it's well over 15 years now. And I think I actually did sleeper stretch for like 2 weeks before I took a step back and said, wait a minute, this is not a good exercise for so many reasons. So, to talk about sleeper stretch, I guess first we talk about the evolution of it. And probably 20 plus years ago now, we started to see the first publications from physicians that worked with injured baseball players that talked about internal rotation loss, or GIRD, so glenohumeral internal rotation deficit, so GIRD. So what happened was, a bunch of doctors, really good doctors, prominent doctors that see injured players, they started noticing, hey, baseball pitchers, they tend to have limited internal rotation when I see them in my clinic when they're hurt. So they said, well, that must be bad. And we started trying to figure out some exercises to increase internal rotation. So sleeper stretch was like a real popular one. By the way, shoulder internal rotation, it's a goofy motion to get back, right? Like in the physical therapy, that people that listen, like you get somebody like general orthopedic, like adhesive capsulitis or post-op shoulder, like that's the goofy one that's super hard to get back. Yeah. Right. So a lot of people were kind of like struggling it, but right at the same time that this started to become popular, we started publishing and kind of going through all our research showing that, wait a minute, this internal rotation loss is normal and not pathological. So, we were trying to kind of do that simultaneously, but unfortunately now, I think if you were to Google like how to work with a baseball player, right? Like GIRD jumps up, increase internal rotation jumps up. Trust me, every physician we still work with sends us players that says, yeah, their shoulder's sore, the GIRD, do sleeper stretch, and we just completely ignore it. We usually teach the player why we'll never do sleeper stretch again.
Yep.
Right. But, because that's part of our goal is to evolve. But, I think that's where it came from. And it didn't come from like a bad spot. Like it was a good idea, but we totally missed the boat that we probably didn't need to work on internal rotation. That actually wasn't an abnormal finding. But then B is, let's not do the most aggressive thing we can. That's almost like a wrestling move, right?
Yeah.
To like, to kind of like torque the joint into internal rotation. Like that's never a good idea, right? Yeah. So that's kind of why we kind of started getting away from it. It's really aggressive and probably not what we should be doing anyway.
And I think it's an interesting conversation because really the landmark paper was that 3-part disabled throwing shoulder article, which came out, I think that was 2003. So we're 17 years later, and that was something that was kind of boldly put out there. And there was some good stuff in that paper. They talked about, the peel back mechanism as an avenue for slap injuries in throwers. But, that was something that, I think it was based also on like this concept of, do we see a thicker posterior capsule in throwers? And we do, but in your opinion, is that clinically significant?
Yeah, and I don't think we actually do see a thicker posterior capsule. We may see, a thickening of like the posterior band of the inferior capsule, which is technically different. Mm-hmm. But, I don't know. I don't know if that's even kind of the real thing because that's kind of a different type of injury. That's it's kind of like a traction type phenomenon that we tend to see. So, I don't know. I don't even think, I actually think you gave all that too much credit with what you just said because you made it actually happened the other way. They said internal rotation is tight. I bet it's the posterior capsule.
Yeah.
They didn't say, oh, it's the posterior capsule, it's limiting posterior. We totally guessed. As a profession, I'm not saying anyone in particular, like internal rotation was tight, therefore it must be the posterior capsule.
Mm-hmm.
So this was getting out there. And then here's the real problem. The people like myself, Kevin Wilk, a bunch of the other like kind of sports PTs that work in baseball, we were trying to raise our hands and say, hey guys, we work with healthy baseball players. They have limited internal rotation too. And by the way, I can probably dislocate all of them out the posterior aspect of their shoulder with ease. Mm-hmm. And we actually even published that. We published a study that showed, we apologize to the players, but we did all the Tampa Bay Rays in spring training one year. We kind of dislocated their shoulders like to measure how hard it was. Mm-hmm. And they could all sublux posteriorly.
Well, didn't Kevin also do a cadaveric model where he actually shined a flashlight through the posterior capsule to demonstrate how small, or I guess insignificant a structure it is that could actually create these kind of adaptations?
Yeah, and we actually this is why podcasts are cool, because I can tell you the real story behind that. That I'm not kidding. That was the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, right? And that's like a big deal. So remember the fellows over at ASMI were doing some shoulder surgeries, type thing. And I remember, I forget which one it was off the top of my head, but I'm just like, hey, dissect down a posterior capsule for me. I want to get a picture. And then Kevin and I ran over there and we were just playing with it in the cadaver lab, like literally Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. We're trying to get back to our family. I have family flying into town. But we took a picture to show like, hey, the posterior capsule, it is not the reason. So we were like trying to scream this from the rooftops, but like, it's never sexy to come out with like the results like that. It's much easier to say internal rotation is limited. It must be the posterior capsule. So like our studies, they're published. You can find them like in Medline, and they didn't get a lot of traction. Like people have selective lit reviews and don't kind of want to see all of them.
I like it. So, you certainly mentioned that, all right, it's not the capsule. So I think we can agree it's an element of retroversion and probably some soft tissue changes that happen presumably in response to eccentric stress. So maybe build on that a little bit, and let's talk about, in addition, the alignment factor where, some folks may have issues more proximally. Like, how are you attacking your internal rotation deficits that you do feel like need to be addressed?
So the first thing we do, and this is the big part, is we do a good, thorough evaluation of the person. And we take internal and external rotation. We do it on both sides. We add them up. We look for total rotational motion, and we try to figure out the puzzle just based on those numbers. And I just saw a kid literally 3, 4, 5 days ago. I forget what it was. It was a very classic story. He said, hey, I'm a high school baseball player. My shoulder's been sore. I saw the doctor. He said I had GIRD. I went to PT. I'm doing the sleeper stretch. My shoulder's not getting any better. So what do you do? So what we do is we bring him in for an evaluation. We look at his numbers. Every time this happens, we find that they have increased their internal rotation too much.
Yep.
So now their total rotational motion is too high, and it's because of that gain in IR. They've destabilized the shoulder. They've made them something worse. And then I look like an expert clinician by simply telling them to stop, right? And that's it. It's addition by subtraction, right? So I would say for the majority of baseball players that I work with, I would say I focus on internal rotation at most 10% of the time.
Yep. What's an interesting follow-up to that? Now, like you were at ASMI this January, we were there together, and that was one of the more compelling, I guess proclamations from the biomechanics folks in-house was that you actually don't need all that much internal rotation to throw a baseball. Right. You don't need you definitely don't need 90 degrees. So when I hear people raving, like, we got him full internal rotation, it's like, well, what did you tear to get there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I hate to say it, but we see it all the time. Then the kid gets an MRI, it shows a posterior capsule tear.
Definitely seen it.
So let's think about this now. Like, when are the physicians going to start putting that piece of that puzzle together that we see that you're like, wait a minute, you said it was tight, so they stretched it. Now it's torn. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a big difference between tight and torn. So, so we have this big like disconnect, but yeah, you probably don't need IR. The baseball player I see that has limited IR is usually the one that is on fire. Right. They're just inflamed. And I can't even say that that's accurately a loss of IR versus just like capsular or cuff like irritation, and all you do is you settle them down and their IR tends to come right back. So I honestly have not done a sleeper stretch, posterior capsule stretch in most of my career. And I don't focus on it at all. And I don't have any problems with my players. You know what I mean? So we're trying to tell people that. We're like, that is, and if you really think about it, you get hurt by losing external rotation more than you get hurt by losing internal rotation.
And we're definitely going to touch on that. That's a good one. Interesting. So my story with the sleeper stretch is I was all in on it. Our mutual friend Neil, the athletic trainer for the Dodgers, kind of turned me on to PRI. I went to my first PRI, postural respiration course. Came back, brought a couple things from that. And we had a high school kid who was just like locked at 25 degrees of IR. And we had been manually stretching him into IR, and he had been doing sleeper stretch on his own just to like try to keep his head above water with it, and gave him a couple positional breathing drills. And sure enough, it was like 35, 40 and pristine, like with zero effort. I was like, all right, this is stupid. So in spite of that, I just searched for Google images for sleeper stretch. On that, you are number 13 and I'm number 16. Luckily, yours says don't use the sleeper stretch. Mine is actually me demonstrating. Fair enough. It's actually decent technique, but it should have a big X through it. So what's your roadmap, right? Let's say you do get that kid that comes in with 10 degrees, right? And you want to just settle it down, and you do feel like you need to at least get some more to kind of piece together that total motion puzzle. What's your kind of checklist? So you start off obviously by settling down if they're symptomatic, and then where do you go from there?
And you said they have a loss of internal rotation?
Yeah, let's say that they have a GIRD side to side of 40 degrees, and total motion is aberrant, and you deem that their dominant shoulder internal rotation is something that needs to be improved. Where are you going first?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think this is at 5 to 10% of the people I see.
Yeah,
to be honest,
agree 100%.
It's pretty rare, but the first thing we always go for, and this is a general rule of thumb with me with all of my kind of rehab principles, is that we want to go to soft tissue first. Mm-hmm. We never ever want to torque a joint for no reason. But this is really funny. In traditional physical therapy education models, there are a lot of them. Most of them are like the older osteopathic approaches, like the manual therapy approaches. They actually teach the kids to go joint first.
Interesting.
And I don't know if it's just because people like you and I, Eric, are just like, we work with so many hypermobile athletes that maybe we're a little jaded, or maybe we just have a better snapshot, but we never ever do that approach with our athletes. And it's an interesting approach. So we always go soft tissue first. We would work on soft tissue of the posterior shoulder, not the capsule. So like posterior rotator cuff, even posterior deltoid, a little teres major sometimes, like that helps a little bit. We work on posterior shoulder soft tissue mobility and then reassess. And that's key. You have to reassess right there. See if you got your motion back, or maybe you got half of it back, right? And then kind of go to that next thing. If that didn't get it back, which it probably would have, then we would probably start doing some stretching like of cross-body adduction. So horizontal adduction, not IR. So again, you see, we're not focusing on IR to get IR back. So we go across the body, maybe a little contract relax, and that would probably be it. But honestly, I'd probably do that for like 2 sessions, and then we'd be moving on to bigger and better things.
I'm in the same boat. I'd say we probably spend a little bit more time proximally too, like soft tissue work on, there's stuff on scalenes, there's stuff on subclavius. You can work on T-spine mobility and get IR. There's all these different boxes you can check before you would actually go to ever even consider like actually torquing the joint. And I think that's probably an important discussion point is, right? We always come back to like a shoulder is a delicate joint. It has a ton of available motion. It's not a hip that you can just crank on and get away with anything. Like you actually have to be a little bit more cognizant. Mechanically, what do you think is happening when people are effectively hurting themselves when they do a sleeper stretch?
Well, I mean, if you actually look at the anatomy of it, what you're doing is you're taking the shoulder, you're kind of closing down the subacromial space where the rotator cuff sits, and you are like torquing the joint at end range, right? And look, we don't do that for any other joint, right? Like, I don't know why we do that. So this is what I always ask players. I say, "Oh, you've been doing the sleeper stretch. What do you think?" And they're like, "I love it." I'm like, "Okay, why do you love it?" He's like, "Oh, I feel it. It feels awesome." Like, where do you feel it? And they point right to the front of their shoulder, and they say, "Yeah, I feel like a big sharp pain right there." I'm like, "Yeah." I go, "That's not your rotator cuff. That's where your rotator cuff attaches." So I always tell them, like, that's the equivalent of saying, "Hey, your quad's tight. Hop on your stomach. Let's flex your knee. Let's bend your knee back. Try to touch your butt." and instead of feeling a stretch in your quad, you felt a sharp pain in your tib, like underneath your kneecap. Like you would never do that stretch, right?
Absolutely.
So I don't know why we do it with the shoulder when the shoulder has like less stability and we're just torquing it. And, I don't know. To me, it's stay away from that. And to be honest with you too, you brought up PRI, you brought up some postural things. To add to that, I would just say, remember, if your primary focus is on stuff proximal and or positional, right, then you will gain IR and lose ER.
Correct.
Just keep that in mind. And remember, I think you get hurt when you lose ER. So I don't even know what I'm saying, but it's just
tread
more
lightly. Tread lightly.
Exactly. Right.
But I think it's when it's structured correctly, right? So you do those things
right.
proximally, but then you have to come back and you've got to look at, do I need to do more work to actively gain control of external rotation or reestablish that? It's essential to distal, right?
I think the most important thing you can do is just make sure you're thoroughly assessing both sides and both ER/IR, and be very strict with what you're trying to accomplish. Like, don't just blindly try to get as much internal rotation as you can, right? Because something else is going to sacrifice if you do too much. I think that would be my biggest thing, is you have to assess.
Mm-hmm. It's a cool party trick to see the transient change of 50 degrees of internal rotation, but very few people go to check and see if they've lost it on the other side.
Right.
So, all right, we're gonna shift gears and we're gonna hit a completely different sacred cow in the baseball industry that's become a big conversation point: weighted baseballs. I think I've been using them since 2009 in some capacity, maybe even before that. Now that I think about it, I think we had some 2008 ones as well. And certainly earlier on, we were throwing a bunch of poop on the wall to see what sticks. And the program has gotten much more refined since then, and we've kind of changed the way that we attack things. You've done some good research on it. So there were two particular papers that have been landmark, in kind of defining, what weighted balls, do, how people respond to them, and also how can we implement them safely. So maybe we cover them one by one. So let's talk about the first one, which I think it won some awards, right? You got a ton of press on the first one.
Yeah, it depends. So our first one was our big 6-week study. So we wanted to see the effects of a 6-week study. And we were the most read article for that journal, the Journal of Sports Health, which is a really big journal. We're the most read article for the year, and we won the award with AOSSM for the best research paper of the year. So the medical community loved it. We also won the award of most hated article on Twitter, right? So, so it's the medical community loved it. They loved our, methodology and what we showed with the results. And I think the rest of the world was just a little stunned that, wait a minute, maybe these things aren't as magical and perfect as we once thought. Maybe we should kind of take a step back. And look, same thing that we said about sleeper stretch. It's not good. It's not bad. It's not any of those things. The popularity was probably a little bit ahead of the science. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's how it works now, especially with social media, right? Yeah. It's so easy to get information out. They became really popular, and a lot of people think they're magical. And unfortunately, here's the part that stinks. It's like the sleeper stretch. Some people actually have a lot of misconceptions about them, that they don't understand the science, and they're based on some of the theories we had 10 years ago on what might be happening, but we're kind of starting to refute those theories. So that's kind of where we are. So we actually, there's 3 phases of the study. One I wasn't involved in, but Dr. Fleissig looked at some of the biomechanics. He's the head biomechanist of ASMI with Dr. Andrews, but he looked at the biomechanics of it. And I think that was a real important paper, just to kind of lay some of the framework of what happens while you throw the ball just one time. Then for us, we wanted to say, what does a very typical program that the kids are doing these days, and I'm not just talking about college minor league guys, but literally 10-year-olds are doing programs like this now. What does a typical program do to the body? So, we had a control group. We had, really strong methodology, or we wouldn't have been published, we wouldn't have won awards, but it was comparing a group that did and didn't do a weighted ball program. And you know what? It's, to give it credit, velocity went up. Yep. And we did see a significant increase in velocity. If you
just to define, what were the age ranges of the subjects in this program, just so that folks know?
It was high school. So off the top of my head, I think it was 14 to 17. Okay. I think our mean age, we calculated our mean age wrong. Only statistically wrong, meaning if you were 15 in 364 days, you were 15.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So when
Yeah.
you look at our mean, it's lower than their actual age because a lot of kids were about to turn 16 or 17 or even 18, but we didn't use like fractional years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it was a little misleading. So I'd say the average age was probably about 16, 17.
Okay.
So it's high school kids, 6-week program. They all did a nice warm up. They all were throwing for a period of time. They were all doing strength training and arm care exercises. Like they were all prepped for this program. One then just started to just continue doing a normal throwing program at 5 ounces, and one started a gradual progression of a weighted ball program. It was a really slow progression. Like the first week, again, off the top of my head, I think they did kneeling throws with a light ball, like 75% effort, 15 times. Like that's it. Like this, it wasn't really aggressive. And it grew over the course of 6 weeks to include running guns and rocker throws and everywhere from 2 ounce to 2 pound balls. And this is exactly what we're seeing the kids bring into us and show us that, hey, these are the programs we're doing.
Yeah.
So,
If anything, I'd say it was even a little bit more moderate than some of the crazy stuff we've seen. It was well structured.
I completely agree. One of the biggest criticisms we got was that the kids did 2 pound running guns.
Yep.
Which A is happening in real life, unfortunately.
Yep.
Something to keep in mind. But B is like running guns with a 2 pound ball kind of self limits.
Yeah.
Like you really don't throw them that hard. Like the velocity is like probably 50%. It's not as stressful as like people necessarily think. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do it, but it was like, I'm not kidding. If you look at the total reps of the program, it was less than 4% of the entire study.
And in reality, those happen a lot more than people realize. They just don't get posted on Twitter because it doesn't blow up the radar gun. You know?
Exactly. That's a great point, right? And keep this in mind too. If you do some variations of any type of throw, rocker, reverse pickoff, anything, if you do that with a 2 up to 5 pound balls, which we're seeing with moderate intensity, with volume, that's actually probably way worse. In terms of like the general scope of the body, that's actually way worse. So again, I appreciate that you said you thought the program was moderate because we called it conservative, to be honest with you. But in a nutshell, velocity went up a little over 3%. That's a pretty good gain. But if you break down our numbers, it's actually a little bit less exciting than you think. So statistically, yes, velocity went up. About 80% of people in the weighted ball group went up. 12% went down.
Interesting.
So it didn't work on everybody. But how about this? In the control group, 65%, give or take, went up in velocity too. Right? So it's, again, these aren't like the gains seen between the two groups weren't like amazing. They weren't outstanding.
And that's clinically significant because we're not just talking about, like, let's be honest, like high school kids, you train them for 6 months, puberty makes you look really smart. 6 weeks is a much shorter time period. So it is clinically significant to see those.
Right. And don't forget the control group was they're still doing some like moderate long toss and stuff with a 5 ounce ball. I mean, nothing crazy. Like we weren't letting them go to like 300 feet. It was just like a 120 program, like intentionally designed to be moderate so we can compare them, and they still went up. Right. So it was kind of interesting. So yes, there were some velocity increases, but the injury rates were the real kicker. So we had to exclude 2 kids from the study during it because they started to have elbow pain. And remember, these aren't subjects. These aren't rats that we put in a cage. These are like our kids. You know what I mean? Like they train at our place. Like these are our people. So we excluded them with elbow pain. But the real kicker for me was 2 others in the next season. They had 2 pretty big injuries. So we had some olecranon stress fractures, and then we actually had a Tommy John that actually decided to retire and not even play past that. He's better at golf than baseball anyway. And so, so we had a 24% injury rate, which is way too high, right? To actually do that. So,
and that's 24% over 6 weeks. Like that to me is the crazy part. Like I think there was like a study a long time ago that was like 57% of pitchers, report some kind of shoulder issue over the course of a competitive calendar. Like, and you hit 24% in 6 weeks. And that is just off the charts to me. So,
right. And we're talking about New England high school kids. Yeah. Right. So they are not getting worn out in their high school season. And you're having a olecranon like fracture. You're having a Tommy John injury in a 16, 17-year-old kid that doesn't have a lot of innings. That's an even bigger finding to me. If we did the study in Texas, who knows what we would have found, right?
Oh, no doubt.
Like something to keep in mind. Like these kids are not abused. these kids aren't going to they weren't going to D1 Vandy stuff like programs. These are just like normal high school kids playing college ball in New England.
Yeah. It's crazy. So that was the first study. You mentioned that there was some outrage. What were some of the nastiest emails and tweets you received?
You know what I always try to kind of relate it to? It's like there's so much traction going in the baseball community that weighted balls were amazing, right? They're perfect. They helped all the theories out there. They increase arm strength. They increase arm speed. They neuromuscular repatterning. I don't know what on earth that phrase means, by the way, right? But all these potential theories, they were kind of all proven wrong. So, Dr. Fleisig's study showed it didn't increase arm strength. Our study actually showed that it probably inhibited arm strength. So our control group went up 13% in their rotator cuff strength in 6 weeks. That's enormous, by the way. You know how proud we are of that fact?
That's a very big deal.
Yeah, that's huge. And our weighted ball group didn't. And of course, it's stressful throwing. That's the first step we always talk to people about. Throwing a baseball is bad for you.
Yep.
Right. So if you add distance, if you add weighted balls, if you add volume, it's just more stress. Right. So of course it's going to inhibit their strength gains.
Even though some of those folks do basically put out there that you will increase arm strength. That's one of my biggest, I wrote an article years ago, throwing doesn't build arm strength, right? It's just a matter of how quickly it falls off. It's pulling the parachute.
Well, think about it. If it were true, then your solution to get a stronger arm is to throw more. And we all know, we see people do this all the time. Their arm starts getting really tired and they're hanging, their mechanics stink. So what do? Well, I got to throw more. That's what Twitter said to do. Right. And they throw more and they get way worse. So, and that's just common sense. But I get everything is so sensationalized on the internet nowadays. It's hard to have kind of common sense. And that's what we're trying to do with the research, is trying to say, hey, look, these things aren't evil. They're just different and they are stressful. Of course they're stressful. Right. So we know that, but we have to dose it appropriately. And again, I think just like the internal rotation thing, I would love to see weighted balls be at no more 10% of what we do with players in the future, because they probably shouldn't be much more than that.
Well, I think, so, all right. So study number one, I think one of the hugest takeaways there, people have to infer from it. And I think it's good for us to put out there is if you're a young athlete, find the easy windows of adaptation, right?
Right.
Get stronger, throw the med ball, do these things that we know are proven effective time and time again that, have dramatically lower injury risk. And then, once you're older, you're more mature, you've got a good foundation in place, start attacking the sexier stuff in the right amount of volumes in an organized program.
Yeah. If you're going to push your physiology a little bit, you have to be you have to have maxed out all your buckets.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to be super strong. You have to be mature. You have to have good arm strength. You should have good mechanics. Yeah. And then let's start pushing the physiology. But look, great example again. Last week, talking to an ex-MLB all-star pitcher. So this guy's no scrub, right? His kids are now in high school, right? So I'm dating myself a little bit here. I know all the old guys, but he's literally sending me videos of his kid. And he's like, I've completely limited his volume as a kid because I've been saving it. So that's great. And he's like, but look, we're struggling to get past low 80s. And he's thinking about doing a weighted ball program, that type of thing. And he sends me a video. The kid has no drive, right? So no linear drive, no rotational power, no hip shoulder separation, right? Why on earth would we give him a weighted ball to throw at this point when he hasn't maximized any of his other buckets? Why would you go to the one thing that adds stress when you could just get stronger, get a more bulletproof arm, have better mechanics that drive down the mound? You know what I mean? Everybody's just jumping the gun because it's just not as sexy, and it's not a quick buy off the internet, right? You can't just buy 12 months of strength training. You know what I mean? You can't just upgrade your body.
And I think we've touched on some good points here, and I think it leads to kind of the third big rock. So talk to me a little bit about why you feel like those guys were getting hurt, because I think it leads to a very important third discussion point.
Yeah. So we talked about the findings that I think the world liked from that study, but there was one finding that drove me crazy, and I hated it. It was that after a 6-week weighted ball program, the players went up in external rotation. So they had more layback of their shoulder. And it wasn't a shift. They didn't lose IR, right? And we kind of
Yeah.
talked about that previously. They gained external rotation, right? And seriously, when we're looking at the numbers, because we're the clinicians, we literally like, oh boy, like that's not what we wanted to find, right? And if you take a step back and think about it, 10, 15, 20 years ago, injuries to baseball players, they were like completely different from what we're seeing right now. Right now, we're actually starting to see traumatic injuries in a repetitive atraumatic sport. So what I mean by that is we're seeing lat tears, teres tears. I saw a pec tear. I saw a rib fracture.
I saw an anterior dislocation.
That's one of the. So anterior dislocation and a cuff tear on one pitch in a mound in a game. I've seen both. It's devastating. The guy's down on the ground. His career's over, and he knows it. Right. A humeral fracture. So we're starting to see traumatic injuries in a repetitive atraumatic sport. It's ridiculous. So when we saw this gain in external rotation, it all made sense. No wonder why we're seeing lat tears. No wonder why we're seeing subscap tears. You know how hard it is to tear your subscap?
You're not kidding.
That's crazy that we're seeing subscap tears. So we're seeing all these like new injuries from this forced layback. And we know through science that more layback equals more velocity, but it also increases stress on your shoulder and your Tommy John ligament. So all of this is starting to sound like common sense, right? You're just like, oh, okay, right. I get it. That makes sense. So yes, you get more layback. Yes, you get more velocity, but it's more stress and more injury rates. And all of a sudden now everything makes more sense. So we saw that in the 6-week program and we were like, whoa, right? But remember, we did like a general 6-week program. So our next study, and this was just published recently a few weeks ago in Sports Health again, our next study, well, we tried to say like, well, wait a minute, let's not throw all the weighted balls out. Maybe some are okay and some are not okay, right? So we wanted to come up with different buckets. So what we did this time is we looked at the acute, so meaning the immediate change in shoulder range of motion from throwing weighted balls. And we had them come on 3 different days. We measured their range of motion. They went and threw some balls. They warmed up, threw some balls, and then we immediately measured their range of motion again, right? We had 3 different groups or 3 different days. One was an underload day. So they went like, 4 ounce, 2 ounce. The next one was a light overload day. I believe it was 6 and 9 ounces. And then the other one, the heavy overload day, was 1 and 2 pounds. And it was funny when we were measuring the kids, like afterwards, when we did the underload balls, no change in range of motion. And that makes sense. That's an interesting finding. We were cool with that. The light overload ball, 6, 9 ounce, we actually started to see it. We were like, okay, all right, that just changed it. But I'm not kidding, Eric. When we looked at the 1, 2 pound balls, the amount of layback was alarming.
I remember you telling me that you and Lenny looked at each other and were like, oh my God.
We looked at each other and we said, I think this is our last study on weighted balls. A, I know everything I need to know, but B, I'm not messing with my kids anymore. I know what I need to know. And I completely understand the science of weighted balls in my head now. Right. So the weighted balls, the heavier the ball you use, and it doesn't matter if it's max intensity or not, right? Stress is an equation. You have to put the intensity with the volume and the weight of the ball together, right? So you just got to play with those variables. But the heavier the ball, the more increase in layback you had. We had some kids with 15 degrees of external rotation increased in like 5 minutes.
That's the crazy part to me, is that you can improve range of motion really, really quickly, right? That's kind of a cool party trick, whatever. You do some soft tissue work, you stretch. It opens you up to this huge risk factor, this huge window of injury. And the problem is the strength and the proprioception, the motor control that it takes to control that new motion, that takes 6 months to develop. You know what I mean? It's a much more chronic adaptation.
Right. And to be honest with you, I think that's a very optimistic thought, which I don't know if we can control that. That is past their physiological limits. And what they've probably done is desensitized the fibers in their shoulder that are designed to limit that, because you're putting yourself at an injury risk. So I don't even know if you can gain control on that, but I think the only thing we don't know is there a happy medium? Like, can you go up 5 degrees, 10 degrees? I don't know what it is, but like, I've learned enough. I think we've definitively proven now in these series of studies that weighted balls do help with velocity. Not probably as much as you think. It's not magical. By the way, the only other study that looked at a 6-week program that had a bunch of different weights of balls in it was actually published by Driveline, and they actually showed no change in velocity.
So one of the things I'm curious about is when this happened. So I'll say this: there have been other studies in the past that have said weighted balls don't increase shoulder external rotation, and when you actually look at the methods, those studies took place at the end of a competitive season. It was almost like, I think it was in pro guys where they threw it on instructs. The assumption there is that, all right, if guys already have 100 innings on their arm, they've already acquired most of their external rotation. Would you agree that like we're talking about Northeast kids in the wintertime, like they're vulnerable early on in that throwing program if you ramp up too quickly? Like to me, that's always been the biggest recipe for disaster with weighted balls. You take a hypermobile kid who doesn't have a foundation of strength, has no body awareness, and then you get him a weighted ball program that on-ramps really quickly.
Right. I think you're totally right. And the only thing I would say, like the thing I would say again, just because we do so much with baseball players, I would say the majority of studies I read on baseball players, they don't measure the shoulder correct. So I actually don't think the other studies are even valid.
Let's talk about that. When you're measuring external rotation, this is something I see all the time. Talk to me about how you do it and where you see the common mistakes are.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing with external rotation is you have to be able to pick up the slack. And most people aren't picking up the slack. Some just report active range of motion.
Yep.
And for people that work in baseball, you realize that the elasticity at their end range is gigantic. Mm-hmm. And if you actually compare it side to side, the elasticity on their throwing side is more than their non-throwing side. Mm-hmm. So if you just bring them to the beginning of resistance, you're not getting their true elasticity. And that's what makes them a baseball player. So most people aren't pushing enough external rotation. If you see a study and like the mean external rotation is like 90 degrees, mm-hmm. just put the study down.
Yeah, it's great. They're obviously they haven't taken it past R1, right? They haven't gone R2.
Yeah. I mean, the kids in our study, dude, they were like 140 degrees of external rotation.
Yeah. So here's an interesting follow-up question to that. So you look at that, and then you also have, like Chris Camp's group has shown, a pretty good relationship between shoulder flexion limitations and, elbow pathology in the season that follows. So are those things kind of at like two different ends of the spectrum? Like the implication there, if shoulder flexion is poor, you're usually thinking lat teres being your limiting factor. Those are also, musculature that would theoretically limit external rotation.
Correct. Right.
So, are we talking about that being a problem, and at the other end of the spectrum, folks who acquire external rotation too quickly being is the secret just to be like right in that happy middle ground?
Yeah, and you got to think of so when we see that loss of shoulder flexion correlates to injury, we have to be careful to not have a false pseudoscience where like A equals B, so B equals C. That's not how it works.
The transitive property of shoulder care.
Yeah, like the shoulder. I could care less about shoulder flexion, but don't get me wrong. I think it's one of the number one barometers of the status of your shoulder. Mm-hmm. So if we look at a guy that throws a ton, and we're talking about the guys that are pushing layback, especially if you're doing long toss, you're doing weighted balls, you're doing all these warm-ups, you get this layback, your lat, your teres, your internal rotators, even like your pec, your subscap, they all get traumatized.
Yep.
Right? So what happens is those all get tight. External rotation gets a little yucky. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they lose elevation because that's the muscles that also you need to have elevation. Mm-hmm. So shoulder flexion in and of itself. So if we use this reverse psychology, then we would be doing inferior joint mobs on all of our people now instead of posterior calf mobs. But it's not A equals B equals C. It's the shoulder flexion to me is the barometer that these guys are messed up. So if you go through a weight ball program for like 6 weeks or even like a whole winter, oftentimes these things are jacked up, and you see them. You look at them side to side, like flexion's like 150 versus normal on the other side. It's a big difference. You just see those muscles are angry.
I think the other thing that's really interesting, and you highlighted I think you said there was at least one olecranon stress fracture, in this group. Like, first off, that's a big deal. I mean, that's basically a Tommy John in terms of the timeline that you're looking to come back from it. It's a more involved surgical intervention too. So I think that for me is the one that jumps out the most because it's a bony issue. You know what I mean? And a lot of times we see a bony issue, and it's the kind of thing where you and I both know you can look at every draft MRI and you're going to see a bunch of stress reactions on elbows. You might see some proximal humeral stuff depending on how the MRI is done. Like, do we have a lot of kids in this, this age demographic of 14 to 18 who are on these aggressive throwing programs, who are really just ticking time bombs? They haven't necessarily hit a symptomatic threshold, but when we actually image them, they do have these bony issues, presumably because, they are skeletally immature still, that are just waiting to reach threshold, and that we need to get in and out of points of stress, with their, not just throwing programs, but the aggressive throwing programs that they're coveting.
Yeah, I mean, you could think about it. We're about to enter a really interesting era in baseball, because this is now the summation of all these kids that have been doing this their entire life now. So this is the first time you could say that the people entering college and minor league baseball grew up doing this, right?
Yeah.
10 years ago, they started dabbling in it, but now this is like a part of the baseball culture. So if you actually look at the trends, if you look at Tommy Johns in baseball, and we don't even know in college, that's probably way worse. If you actually look at it, the amount of Tommy Johns in Major League Baseball is slightly down.
Yeah.
Right? It's actually down a little bit, but Major League Baseball, minor league baseball, it's 4 times higher. That's absurd.
It's insane.
It's absurd how many are. So I think, if you look 20 years ago, like when I first started doing this stuff, I feel like the person that got Tommy John was like the 33, 35-year-old veteran with mileage, right? And I think that's part of why our success rates were so good, is they really weren't terrible. They just had mileage, right? So they had a lot of wear and tear from the years, and they got back, they were okay. I think what we're seeing now is the peak, where instead of you getting injured 30, 35, you're getting injured kind of like in college, in minor league baseball now. And it is going to be very interesting to see how many of these people make it back, because now we're starting to see multiple Tommy Johns, right? We never saw that before.
Yeah.
Revisions, never saw that,
yeah.
right? So now we're seeing multiple Tommy Johns. We're seeing people. So I wonder if our careers are being shortened big time, and that's why we're starting to see the arc shift, that we're starting to have injuries earlier. And I honestly can't say. I don't think we're going to see a lot of 200 inning guys anymore, and I don't think we're going to see a lot of 2,000 inning guys anymore.
I had this conversation the other day with a couple of different guys, in fact. So one of the things that we kind of indirectly hinted at, but we didn't actually discuss. So obviously one of the big reasons why we think we're seeing, I would say we can even say we know we're seeing more injuries with weighted ball programs, is the rapid increase in passive external rotation, right? So that happens quickly. And what's interesting is range of motion studies in baseball can be tricky, right? There's some that have shown that GIRD matters and some that show that it doesn't, right? So sometimes they can be a little intriguing. So I'm curious, does this just lend more credence to the thought that above all else, that shoulder has to be strong, right? We need to have a cuff that is able to manage the arthrokinemax of the joint correctly, to overcome maybe the crazy things that are happening osteokinematically as we get, grittier through our lats and as we acquire way more external rotation.
Absolutely. I think it's going to always come down to that. So what we're seeing is the current generation of baseball players destabilize their shoulders more so than the past. Mm-hmm. So they're creating larger amounts of range of motion, larger amounts of windows of total rotational motion. So they're so more mobile that they have to be strong and dynamically stabilized. Mm-hmm. The problem is then they throw so much every freaking day that even if you get really strong, you're super tired and fatigued. I don't know. I hate to sound pessimistic, and I am more on the medical side of things, but it's not a good recipe that we're in right now. We're in a really weird time in baseball. And, I hope 10 years from now we look back and we get through this, but man, I wish it was as simple as just saying you need to get your shoulder stronger.
I like it. So I'm going to ask you one follow-up question, but I think it's good to recap, right? So don't sleep or stretch. There are better ways to get the job done that don't provoke things as much. Weighted balls work. They probably don't work quite as well as we thought they do. And we need to make sure that they're used in the right populations, in the right doses, at the right times. We know that acquiring external rotation quickly is probably a recipe for shoulder, elbow, or a host of other issues that, are emerging, it seems like, daily. Strength matters a ton, even when we don't know that range of motion matters, because that's a little bit more questionable. Having a strong shoulder joint, particularly the rotator cuff musculature, is huge. So those are our 4 key takeaways. This is going to save me a bunch of time because I can just send people to this podcast to hammer all of them. But I want to throw one more at you. And this is the closing question is, what do we do about it? Right? Cause, I'll say this, right? I've been to strength conditioning conferences. I've been to pitching conferences, and I've been to sports medicine conferences. And we always ask surgeons what to do. And every time it becomes like, it's like the grandpa from The Simpsons, right? He's on his porch, like yelling at kids to get off his yard. And young kids do not, they don't identify with that, right? Because
right.
the assumption is that, they're just focused on keeping people healthy. They don't know how to actually develop. And, is the solution to propose better ways of doing this? Is the solution to highlight pro athletes who have done things the right way? Because it's not just as simple as don't throw, don't play catch past 90 degrees. Because we both know you can tell people long toss is dangerous or whatever it is. They're still going to go throw 350. What's the solution in your eyes to make this better?
I think we got to teach the coaches, because the coaches are the ones selling it to the parents and the kids, and they're the ones that are, probably making the bigger difference. Our job as the medical community is to do the research and then share the science, so that way then the coaches can make the adjustment with what they do every day. So look, again, weighted balls, like you said, they work, probably not as magical as we think, but they increase the stress. Let's just call a spade a spade. Long toss, weighted balls, the more aggressive you are, the more you throw, it's just more stressful. We have to lower our dosing. We're just overdosing, right? So nothing's evil. You can use a 20-pound ball for all I care, right? It's all a change of the equation. It's physics, right? So we have to teach the coaches that, but then more importantly, I think this is the biggest thing we have to teach the coaches, that this should be a small part of their development. This is not magic. So most coaches that are just blindly doing this right now, Eric, this. Yeah. They think it's magical. They think not only is it safe, but it's protective, and they think it works in everybody. And then literally 5 kids on their college team get Tommy John surgery in one season. And you're like,
we have seen that.
Yes, we've seen that.
We both know which program we're talking about. I think it was like 5 Tommy Johns and a lat in a single fall when they adopted something like this.
And I know 3 colleges in New England that I can think of just off the top of my head that happened to, right? So I think we have to say is, look, this is a small part of it. It is stressful. It is more stressful. So we have to be careful how we dose it. But more importantly, this is not how you develop pitching performance. It's a very small variable, and the other ways are probably more effective and no stress. But one last thing I wanted to add. I know we're running out of time. One last thing. New study was just published this year that showed that 87% of the force that contributes to your velocity on your fastball comes from your legs and your transfer through your core. It's not your arm. And we know that. We all know that. You know that. I know that. The medical community knows it. The strength community knows that. We cannot focus on the 13% if we're trying to increase velocity. You don't want to throw a weighted ball. You want to get your linear strength, your leg strength, your linear power, your rotational power, your trunk. Like, that is how you develop pitching performance. Otherwise, we're just going to have a bunch of guys that throw really hard for a short amount of time and can't throw strikes.
That's awesome stuff. All right. So shameless self-promotion. We have a sale. The coupon code is MLB2020EC. That gets you 25% off on all functional stability training modules. The full package is already heavily discounted if you buy it together, and it's even more so. So that's a great deal. There's 4 different ones. Folks can check it out. It's at functionalstability.com. That runs until Sunday, 7/26. At midnight. If you listen to this podcast in 2023, sorry, you're missing out.
Awesome.
Mike, thank you very much for joining us. Folks can find out more about you at MikeReinold.com. It's Mike Reinold on Twitter as well, correct?
Yeah, I have almost everything. So
everything,
Mike Reinold at everything except Gmail. I'm still angry about that. Don't email that dude. He's in Germany somewhere. It's not good, but
nice. But Instagram and Twitter, you're there.
Yes, but thank you, Eric. Thanks. It's an honor to be involved, and good luck with the rest of the show. Congrats. Thanks again.
This is fun. Thanks, bub. A friendly reminder as we wrap up, that sale on functional stability training goes through this Sunday, July 26th at midnight. If you head to functionalstability.com and enter the coupon code MLB2020EC at checkout, it'll get you 25% off on this popular resource that I think you'll really enjoy.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.